Anna Frank's. Chapter 1. Sunshine and Laughter. I was born Anneliese Marie Frank in Frankfurt, Germany, on a sunny day in June 1929. My family was happy. We had a big house with a red-tiled roof and a cozy front porch where Mama would put out flower pots every spring. Inside, the living room had a big, comfy couch where we'd cuddle with Papa on rainy days, listening to stories about brave knights and magical fairies. We even had a gramophone, a giant box that played music when you wound it up. The afternoons were filled with waltzes and silly songs, making the whole house shake with laughter. The kitchen was Mama's kingdom. It smelled amazing all the time, of freshly baked bread, sweet apple pie, and sometimes even chocolate cake, our favorite. Mama was a fantastic cook, and her meals were like tiny works of art. We'd help her set the table, carefully placing plates, forks, and spoons in their right spots. Dinner time was always a happy time, filled with chatter and stories about our day at school or funny things Meeps, our cat, had done. Meeps was a fluffy ball of white with big, emerald green eyes. She followed us everywhere, purring contentedly when we stroked her soft fur. Sometimes, she'd jump onto our laps as we did our homework, demanding attention with a gentle nudge of her head. We'd sneak her bits of our snacks when Mama wasn't looking, and she'd reward us with happy meows and playful swats of her paw. Climbing the creaky stairs took us to the second floor, where our bedrooms were. Mine and Margot's rooms were next to each other, connected by a small door. My room had sunshine yellow walls with pictures of flowers and animals. My bed was a cozy haven, with a fluffy teddy bear named Buttons always waiting for nighttime cuddles. School was an exciting adventure every day. It wasn't just about learning to read and write, though that was pretty cool too. We had a big playground where we'd spend our breaks running, climbing, and playing tag with friends. Sometimes, the older boys would play soccer, and we'd try to copy them, giggling as we tripped over our own feet. We had music lessons too, where we learned to sing silly songs about animals and play simple melodies on the recorder. Chapter 2. Escape to Amsterdam. In 1933, when I was just 4 years old, a big change happened to our happy life. Papa came home one evening looking very worried. He sat us down at the kitchen table, and even Meeps, who usually loved to curl up in his lap, seemed to sense something was wrong. Papa explained that things in Germany were getting dangerous for people like us Jews. Hitler, the bad man who had become leader, didn't like us and wanted to hurt people who were Jewish. It didn't make sense to us. We were kind people, just like everyone else. We went to school, played with friends, and helped Mama around the house. Saying goodbye to our house was the hardest part. We hugged it goodbye as if it were a giant, friendly teddy bear. We left behind all our toys, except for a few favorites, and even Meeps had to stay with a kind neighbor who promised to take good care of her. The train ride to Amsterdam seemed to take forever. We sat squeezed together, staring out the window at unfamiliar towns whizzing by. We didn't know what awaited us in Amsterdam, but we knew it couldn't be worse than leaving everything we loved behind. When we finally arrived in Amsterdam, it felt like a different world. The houses were tall and narrow, with colorful flowers overflowing from window boxes. Canals, like shiny blue ribbons, snaked through the city, and people rode bicycles everywhere. Even grandmas with shopping baskets balanced on their handlebars. At first, things were better. We found a new apartment, not as big as our house in Frankfurt, but it had a balcony where we could watch the boats go by on the canal. We made new friends at school, even though learning Dutch, the language everyone spoke here, was a bit tricky at first. Mama found a job at a bakery, filling the house with the delicious smell of fresh bread again. But even in Amsterdam, the shadow of what was happening in Germany loomed large. News reports told stories of Hitler's army invading other countries. People whispered worriedly on the streets. We knew things could change again, and the happy life we were slowly building in Amsterdam might be taken away too. Chapter 3: A Hidden World. On my 13th birthday in 1942, something amazing happened. Papa gave me a beautiful present, a diary with a red checkered cover. It wasn't just any diary. It felt like a secret friend I could tell all my thoughts and feelings to. I named her Kitty, and I knew we'd have many adventures together. But that same year, dark clouds returned. The Nazis, the bad people who followed Hitler, took over the Netherlands too. Life became dangerous for Jews once again. We couldn't go to school anymore, and people started looking at us with suspicion. It felt like everyone was whispering and pointing fingers. One day, Papa came home with a worried look on his face. He sat us down at the kitchen table, and even Kitty, who usually sat by my side listening to my stories, felt the tense atmosphere. Papa explained that things were getting much worse for Jews in the Netherlands. He had a secret plan to keep us safe. Behind his office building, there was a hidden place called the Annex. It was like a tiny secret world, completely shut off from the outside. To get there, you had to climb a narrow staircase that was hidden behind a bookcase. It sounded like something out of a fairy tale, but this wasn't a happy story. It was our only chance to escape the danger that loomed outside. On July 6, 1942, our lives changed forever. We packed only the most important things, a few clothes, some photos to remember our happy times, and of course, my precious Kitty. Saying goodbye to our apartment was heartbreaking. We left everything behind, hoping one day we could return. Moving into the Annex felt like stepping into a different world. It was small and cramped, with only a few tiny rooms. We had to be very quiet, tiptoeing around and whispering all the time. We couldn't open windows or make any noise that might alert people outside. It felt like living in a cage, but it was safer than being outside where the Nazis could find us. We weren't alone in this hidden world. Joining our family were the Van Pels family, Mr. and Mrs. Van Pels, their son Peter, and an elderly dentist named Mr. Dussel. Sharing such a small space with 8 people was difficult. We had to learn to get along, even when we felt frustrated or annoyed. But there were good moments too. We played board games by candlelight, whispering stories and jokes. Mama did her best to make the tiny space feel like home. She even managed to bake birthday cakes for Margot and me, even though there wasn't a proper oven in the annex. Kitty became my constant companion. I poured out all my worries, dreams, and frustrations into her pages, finding solace in this secret world we shared. Life in the annex was strange and scary, but we clung to hope. We hoped the war would end soon, and we could finally step out of this hidden world and breathe freely again. Chapter 4: Life in Hiding. The annex was tiny, like a dollhouse with cramped rooms and low ceilings. We had to be silent ninjas, tiptoeing everywhere and whispering like the wind rustling leaves. Opening windows was a big no-no, and going outside felt like a distant dream. Our days stretched out long and quiet, filled with activities done in hushed tones. Reading became our escape. We devoured books borrowed from a kind helper, getting lost in adventures and faraway lands. Papa would read us stories in the evenings, his voice a soothing rumble in the dim light. We even started a book club, taking turns reading aloud and discussing characters and plot twists. Writing became my personal playground. Kitty, my red checkered diary, held all my secrets. I poured my heart out on its pages, writing about the frustrations of being cooped up, the dreams that kept me going, and the occasional arguments with Margot. We bickered like sisters do, over silly things like who got the bigger piece of bread or whose turn it was to wash the dishes. But in the quiet of the annex, these small things felt magnified. Sometimes, to escape the reality of our situation, I wrote stories. I created imaginary worlds filled with brave princesses, funny talking animals, and daring adventures. In these stories, I was the heroine, overcoming obstacles and achieving my dreams. Writing gave me a sense of control, letting me escape the cage of the annex and soar into the land of imagination. Games were another way to pass the time. We played board games by candlelight, our hushed giggles echoing in the stillness. We invented card games, using pebbles as markers and scraps of paper as cards. We even tried to learn chess from Mr. Dussel, but his patience wore thin with our constant blunders. Living in the annex was like living in a constant state of suspense. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren, sent shivers down our spines. We were constantly aware of the danger lurking outside, the ever-present fear of discovery. But we also had moments of joy, stolen moments of laughter, and shared experiences that kept us going. We celebrated birthdays in secret, singing softly and blowing out candles on homemade cakes. We listened to the radio at night, catching snippets of news from the outside world that offered a glimmer of hope. We shared stories about our lives before the war, remembering happier times with a bittersweet ache. Life in the Annex was a strange and challenging experience. We were prisoners in our own home, living in fear and uncertainty. But through it all, we clung to hope, the hope that the war would end, and we could step out of the shadows and reclaim our lives. Chapter 5: 2 Years of Secrets. 2 long years crawled by like a grumpy snail. We lived a hidden life, tucked away in the Annex, constantly on tiptoe. A few brave helpers, like silent guardian angels, brought us food and whispered news from the outside world. Their visits were our lifeline to a reality beyond the 4 walls of the Annex. The news they brought was rarely good. We learned of the war raging on, of battles fought and cities destroyed. We heard stories of courage and resistance against the Nazis, a flicker of hope amidst the darkness. We clung to that hope, a fragile flame that kept us going. Living with so many people in such a small space was a recipe for disagreements. Mr. Van Pels, with his booming voice and bossy ways, often clashed with Papa. Mrs. Van Pels constantly worried about everything, making even the smallest decision a drama. Peter, the Van Pels son, was a bit older than me, and we sometimes bickered over silly things like who got to read the comics first. Sharing a bathroom and kitchen with 8 people meant constant compromise. We had schedules for showers and cooking times, and even a squabble over whose turn it was to wash the dishes felt like a major crisis. The tension sometimes felt thick enough to cut with a butter knife. But there were moments of joy too, like tiny sunbeams breaking through the clouds. We celebrated birthdays in secret, baking small cakes with borrowed ingredients. The glow of a single candle and whispered birthday wishes warmed our hearts. We sang silly songs, our voices muffled but full of laughter. Radio broadcasts became a precious ritual. We huddled together in the evenings, straining to hear news reports from faraway lands. Even though the news was often grim, it was a connection to the outside world, a reminder that life still existed beyond our hidden cage. Sometimes, Margot and I would sneak out onto the small landing outside our rooms. We'd look up at the sliver of night sky, a tiny window to the vast world beyond. We'd whisper dreams and hopes for a future where we could walk freely under the stars, without fear or hiding. Living in the Annex was a constant struggle between fear and hope. The fear of discovery was always present, a heavy weight on our chests. But we also held on to hope, a tiny ember refusing to be extinguished. We hoped for a world where we could be ourselves again, where laughter echoed without restraint, and where sunlight streamed through open windows, not just a sliver peeking through a hidden attic. Chapter 6: The End of the Secret. The summer of 1944 arrived, but it brought no warmth to the hidden life within the Annex. A heavy feeling of unease settled over us. Whispers of increased police activity and raids on suspected hiding places reached our ears through our brave helpers. The fear that had always lurked in the shadows seemed to grow bigger and bolder. Then, on a terrible day in August, our worst nightmare became reality. A loud crash echoed from downstairs, followed by shouts and heavy footsteps. Our hearts pounded like trapped birds in our chests. Mr. Kugler, one of our helpers, had been betrayed. The Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, had stormed into the building. Panic filled the air. We scrambled to hide anything that might reveal our presence. Diaries, photos, letters. The secret door leading to the annex was flung open, harsh light streaming in and shattering the hidden world we had built. We were all rounded up, fear etched on our faces. Our 2 years of living in secret, hoping for a brighter future, came crashing down in a single terrifying moment. The journey that followed was a blur of fear and confusion. We were crammed into crowded cattle cars, separated from each other in the chaos. The once familiar faces of my family and friends were lost in the throng of scared people. The train ride seemed to stretch on forever, the heat stifling and the air thick with the smell of sweat and despair. Finally, the train screeched to a halt, and we were herded out like cattle. We arrived at a place that seemed like a nightmare come to life. Barbed wire fences stretched as far as the eye could see, and skeletal figures clad in striped uniforms shuffled around lifelessly. This was a concentration camp, a place of unimaginable horror. The world in the camp was a brutal one. We were stripped of our belongings, even our names. We were given numbers tattooed on our arms, becoming mere statistics in a monstrous machine. Hunger gnawed at our bellies constantly, and the food we received was barely enough to keep us alive. Every day was a struggle for survival. We were forced to work long hours, doing backbreaking labor under the watchful eyes of cruel guards. Exhaustion was a constant companion, our bodies growing weaker with each passing day. Disease spread like wildfire through the crowded barracks, taking its toll on the already frail. Despite the despair, there were moments of flickering hope. A stolen glance exchanged with Margot across the crowded workyard. A kind word whispered by a fellow prisoner. A shared crust of bread, a small act of defiance against our captors. These tiny moments reminded us of our humanity, that even in the darkest of places, a spark of kindness could still exist. Sadly, the war continued to rage on, but news of victories for the Allied forces reached the camps in hushed whispers. A fragile hope blossomed. Maybe, just maybe, liberation was on the horizon. But for me and many others, it came too late. In early 1945, just weeks before the Bergen-Belsen camp was finally liberated, I succumbed to typhus, a disease that ravaged the camp. My body, weakened by hunger and exhaustion, simply couldn't fight it anymore. I died with the dream of freedom just out of reach, a dream that turned into a powerful testament to the human spirit's ability to endure even in the face of unimaginable hardship. My diary, Kitty, survived the war. It was hidden by Miep Gies, one of our brave helpers, and later published. Through the words I wrote in its pages, my story, and the story of the millions who perished in the Holocaust, lived on. It became a beacon of hope, a reminder of the importance of fighting for freedom and the dangers of hatred and prejudice. Although my life was cut short, my words continue to inspire people around the world. My story serves as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of hope, even in the darkest of times. Epilogue. My father, Otto, was the only survivor from our group. After the war, he found my diary, which had been saved by our helpers. He published it, and it became a book called The Diary of a Young Girl. Through my diary, people all over the world learned about my story and the horrors of the war. My words may be a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope and courage can endure.